It was a headline that seemed to split the public in an instant. Samantha Markle revives her defamation lawsuit against Meghan, accusing her half-sister of erasing her very existence. The words "I grew up as an only child" spoken by Meghan in her high-profile sit-downs, and most famously during the Oprah interview in 2021, have now become the centerpiece of a legal battle that refuses to die. What to some sounded like a casual remark to Samantha was nothing less than a declaration that she never existed, a brutal strike that, in her telling, shattered her reputation and silenced her life for years. The courtroom documents paint a picture of persistence. This is not the first time Samantha has filed. The suit, first lodged in Florida, stalled through procedural delays and motions to dismiss, but unlike other cases that fizzle out under pressure, hers kept coming back. Each refiling has been read as a signal of intent. She is not seeking a moment of tabloid attention, but rather a formal reckoning. For Meghan, who has built a global brand around resilience, independence, and carefully curated storytelling, this persistence carries a different weight. A lawsuit that survives attrition becomes a real threat, because every reopening of the case creates a fresh headline, and every fresh headline invites scrutiny of the narrative she has long tried to protect. The stakes are clear when one revisits the Oprah conversation. Meghan, in front of a global audience of millions, portrayed a life of isolation, describing herself as someone who grew up as an only child. To her supporters, it was a metaphor, a way of explaining distance from estranged relatives. To Samantha, it was a knife twist, a calculated erasure that recast her as a stranger, or worse, as an opportunist who only emerged once Meghan married into royalty. Court filings emphasize that Meghan's words were not harmless anecdotes, but deliberate constructs crafted with the aid of high-level PR teams to frame Samantha as bitter, dangerous, and irrelevant. For Samantha, this is not just about family hurt. She alleges she lost 7 years of her life to reputational fallout. Reports surfaced labeling her obsessed, unstable, even falsely claiming that Scotland Yard had placed her on a fixated person watch list. Though later disproven, the damage was already done. To her, this was not coincidence, but a systematic attempt to assassinate her character, to delegitimize her before she even had the chance to defend herself. Public memory of those early months after Meghan and Harry's departure from royal duties adds more texture. At that time, mainstream media largely upheld the Cinderella narrative Meghan as the outsider who braved a hostile palace and built her own future. In that storyline, dissenting voices, be they Samantha's Thomas Markle's or Meghan's former friends, were quickly dismissed as toxic distractions. But years later, with a courtroom battle reopened, those voices are no longer whispers on tabloid margins. They are entered into evidence, cross-referenced with interviews, and filed before a judge. This is why Samantha's revival of the lawsuit carries such symbolic weight. It threatens to puncture the armor of Meghan's carefully polished image, to transform what was once seen as a fairy tale into a question of truth versus fabrication. Legal experts note that defamation suits are notoriously hard to win, especially when involving public figures. But even without a final verdict, the proceedings themselves can shift perception. For Meghan, perception is power, and a courtroom transcript is harder to spin than a glossy magazine feature. And so with the case now officially back on the docket, the story moves beyond whispers and into the legal record. Samantha frames it as a fight for vindication, a chance to reclaim her name from years of being smeared. Meghan frames it through her team as yet another attempt by estranged relatives to cash in on her fame. Between those poles lies the battlefield of public opinion, where each filing, each leaked document, and each press release will be dissected, amplified, and weaponized. But if Samantha's lawsuit was already a thorn in Meghan's narrative, the next twist would transform it into something even more dramatic, because someone long presumed absent from the arena is now preparing to step in, and his involvement could tilt the entire case onto a new and perilous path. But everything became more complicated when a figure thought to be outside the drama suddenly stepped into the legal battlefield. The re-entry of Samantha Markle into the courtroom would have been enough to stir headlines, but the case escalated to a different level when her father, Thomas Markle, announced his willingness to testify. To many, it was a shocking development because Thomas had been largely absent from the public stage since suffering a stroke in 2022 while living in Rosarito, Mexico. For months, he was seen as frail, isolated, and recovering, yet now, despite lingering health concerns, he is prepared to place himself at the center of a legal showdown against his own daughter. In the language of drama, this was not just a family feud. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind, of father stepping into the arena against the child he once supported. Thomas's appearance in the case is not symbolic alone. It carries evidentiary weight. He has long maintained that he financed Meghan's early ambitions, covering tuition fees at Immaculate Heart High School, supporting acting classes, even granting her access to Hollywood studio environments where he worked as a lighting director. To him, these are not forgotten anecdotes. but concrete contributions proof that he was not the absent father painted in Meghan's narrative, but a presence who helped build the very foundation of the life she now recounts to the world. His statement suggests that Meghan's portrayal of herself as self-made, estranged, and unsupported erases his role not just emotionally, but historically. This claim becomes powerful in a courtroom where testimony is weighed against public narrative. For Samantha, her father's involvement is nothing short of a gift. The living embodiment of the story she wants to tell that Meghan's carefully polished brand depends on minimizing, if not erasing, the people who once stood closest to her. And for Meghan, the stakes rise immediately because it is one thing to dismiss a half-sister as bitter, quite another to confront a father whose voice carries not just memory, but receipts. Media outlets have already sensed the shift. British tabloids plastered front pages with phrases like "father versus daughter in courtroom clash" and "Thomas Markle, my turn to speak." American outlets framed it as a heartbreaking rupture, a father testifying against his own child, fueling debates on talk shows and podcasts about loyalty, truth, and the weaponization of family ties in the age of celebrity. The legal context now overlaps with a cultural question. Who holds the right to tell the story of Meghan Markle's childhood, the woman herself or the family she left behind? Yet the tension does not rest solely on emotional betrayal. According to preliminary filings, Thomas is prepared to provide material evidence, letters, financial records, and even photographic material from Meghan's upbringing, which he says demonstrate years of support and close presence. If introduced, such documents would serve as hard counters to Meghan's claim of isolation, transforming vague family disputes into tangible evidence before a judge. For the public who often consume royal drama through rumor and tabloid conjecture, the possibility of certified documents being read aloud in court is electrifying. Already, debate rages across social media. Supporters of Meghan argue that her father's history of speaking to tabloids discredits him, casting his testimony as opportunistic. Samantha's allies counter that his willingness to testify under oath sets this apart from past tabloid chatter, since a courtroom submission carries the risk of perjury. In this clash of credibility, the courtroom becomes not just a legal battleground, but the ultimate arena for narrative control. And just as the case seemed to settle into this binary, Meghan versus her estranged family daughter, versus father's sister versus sister, another layer surfaced that shifted the weight of perception even further. Reports emerged of a document circulated within media and legal circles that seemed to validate Samantha's claim of reputational assassination, a document that looked at first glance like a piece of evidence impossible to dismiss, one that threatened to collapse Meghan's defense before the trial even began. And then a document appeared, one that seemed impossible to refute, pushing the public firmly towards Samantha's side until the ground shifted again. The leaked document seemed at first to be the smoking gun Samantha had long promised. Circulated through media circles, it appeared to validate her claim that Meghan's public statements and PR strategy had painted her as dangerous, even unstable, and included references to a supposed fixated persons list, a list maintained by Scotland Yard of individuals considered threats. For many, this was the proof that Meghan's camp had weaponized state-level associations to silence her half-sister, a revelation so stark that commentators declared Samantha's case all but won. Hashtags began to spread. Haj erased sister, Haj Meghan exposed, and for a brief moment, it seemed the tide of public opinion had fully shifted. But the narrative cracked almost as quickly as it had solidified. Within days, Scotland Yard released a clarifying statement Samantha Markle had never appeared on such a list, and the reports that tied her name to it were unfounded. What had looked like undeniable evidence was in fact a distortion, and this reversal forced the public to ask a deeper question. If Samantha had not been on the list, then who placed her name in the rumor mill to begin with, and to what end? The collapse of the fixated list story did more than just weaken Samantha's legal arguments. It reframed the entire conflict. Rather than a simple story of one sister silencing another, the spotlight turned toward the machinery of public relations, the invisible hands shaping narratives behind the scenes. Analysts began to suggest that Samantha might not simply be fighting Meghan, but rather the sophisticated PR apparatus surrounding her, a team of strategists, lawyers, and media advisors capable of planning, amplifying, and retracting stories with precision timing. The idea that Samantha's reputation had been destroyed not just by her sister's words, but by an entire professional campaign gave the feud a new dimension, one that reached far beyond family grievances. For Meghan's defenders, this reversal was ammunition. If such a crucial detail had been misreported, then perhaps Samantha was exaggerating all along, painting herself as a victim, while failing to account for her own role in fueling controversy. For Meghan's critics, however, the retraction only added to suspicions of manipulation. Was this simply another example of how narratives could be engineered? allowing Meghan to deny responsibility while the damage lingered. Either way, the twist ensured that the debate was no longer about sibling rivalry alone, but about how truth itself is manufactured in the court of public opinion. Talk shows across the US and UK seized on the moment, inviting PR experts to explain how celebrity teams can seed damaging stories against rivals, then disavow them once their purpose has been served. Former royal correspondents noted the irony. Meghan, who often described herself as a victim of palace leaks and media distortion, now faced accusations of deploying the same tactics against her own family. It was a dramatic inversion, the survivor of manipulation, reframed as the manipulator. Court filings soon reflected this new angle. Samantha's lawyers shifted language, emphasizing not just the harm done by Meghan's words, but the pattern of calculated narrative control that accompanied them. They argued that reputational damage was not an accidental byproduct of interviews, but the result of deliberate strategy with false stories, like the fixated list serving as part of a larger campaign to delegitimize anyone who challenged Meghan's version of events. The public, meanwhile, was left oscillating between skepticism and outrage, unsure of where the truth really lay. If Meghan had indeed benefited from false reports even indirectly, it raised a haunting question. How many other voices had been erased? How many other stories buried under the weight of her brand? And yet, as shocking as this reversal was, it was not the final word. Because just as the debate seemed to settle into a stalemate, with Meghan accused of weaponizing PR and Samantha scrambling to regain footing, after the collapse of her strongest evidence, another revelation emerged, one that did not just question narratives, but cut straight into the heart of Meghan's personal relationships, exposing a pattern that could dismantle the Cinderella image once and for all. But this shock was only the beginning. The next revelation would expose a deeper pattern, one that struck at the very foundation of Meghan's carefully crafted story. If the collapse of the fixated list rumor had raised questions about PR manipulation, the next revelation would strike at Meghan's personal credibility, tearing into the very relationships that once defined her rise. Samantha's legal filings, supported by interviews and media records, began painting a picture of a consistent pattern. People closest to Meghan, allies, mentors, even family had been discarded. Once their usefulness ended, often left to face reputational ruin in her wake. What was at first dismissed as bitterness now appeared as a trail, a chain of severed ties that followed the same script again and again. Jessica Mulroney, once Meghan's most visible confidant, was abruptly cut off in 2020 after a social media controversy. Overnight, the woman who had styled Meghan's wedding, stood by her through early royal days, and defended her in the press, was airbrushed out of the Duchess's narrative. Then came Trevor Engelson, Meghan's first husband, who friends recalled was left devastated by a divorce so abrupt, he described it as being treated like gum stuck to her shoe. Layered onto this were other quiet estrangements, old colleagues, longtime friends, even her extended family members who claimed their calls simply stopped being returned. For Samantha, this was not coincidence. It was a strategy, a deliberate erasure of anyone who no longer fit the brand Meghan was constructing. This pattern, introduced in court, shifted the entire tone of the case. No longer was Samantha's lawsuit just about one contested interview line. It was about whether Meghan's entire public persona had been built by systematically discarding and discrediting those who might complicate the story. Commentators described it as the discarded allies narrative, and in media shorthand, it was devastating. Because while one family feud could be excused, a chain of fractured relationships painted a much darker picture, one that suggested intent rather than accident. International press picked it up immediately. The Times ran a headline reading, "From Best Friend to Forgotten Meghan's Pattern of Erasure." American networks ran timelines of friendships that ended abruptly, while Canadian outlets resurfaced Jessica Mulroney's silence, interpreting it as proof that even her staunchest allies could not escape the pattern. For Samantha, this coverage provided exactly the context she needed. Meghan's portrayal of herself as a victim of toxic relatives began to look less convincing when placed against a trail of discarded companions, each quietly echoing a similar story of being left behind. Inside the courtroom, Meghan's team tried to push back, framing each case as unrelated, the natural evolution of friendships under public pressure. But the cumulative effect was hard to deny. In defamation suits, patterns matter. They suggest intention. And here the pattern was clear. When someone's presence no longer served Meghan's narrative, they were removed, often in ways that left them branded as bitter, unstable, or irrelevant. Public reaction was visceral. Hashtags shifted from sympathy to suspicion. Erased by Meghan, discarded allies. The Cinderella story, once untouchable, began to fray. Opinion polls and tabloid surveys showed a swing. Fewer respondents now described Meghan as a survivor of family dysfunction. More were beginning to see her as an architect of her own myth. This was the most dangerous territory for her brand because reputation is not lost all at once, but unravels thread by thread until the fabric is gone. Yet, as explosive as this revelation was, it did not signal the end because Meghan still had tools at her disposal, including global platforms' legal muscle and the loyalty of defenders who continued to frame her as a woman under siege. The question looming over the next phase was not whether Samantha's accusations had gained traction. They clearly had, but whether Meghan could execute one final move to reclaim control of the narrative, a move bold enough to either salvage her global brand or confirm the darkest suspicions about her rise. But Meghan was not done yet. One final move remained a last card that could either save her carefully built image or bring it crashing down for good. By the time Samantha's case reached this phase, the story had grown far beyond a sister's defamation claim. What began as a legal dispute over a single phrase in an interview had evolved into a broader reckoning, one that tested the strength of Meghan's public image against the weight of testimony documents and a pattern of broken ties. The courtroom was no longer just a venue for legal arguments. It had become the stage where two versions of Meghan Markle collided: the self-made survivor who escaped a toxic environment and the orchestrator of a narrative that erased inconvenient voices to preserve her global brand. For Meghan, the stakes could not be higher. Each headline about the lawsuit risked eroding the polished identity she had cultivated since stepping into royal life, an identity that had brought lucrative media deals, speaking engagements, and a platform that transcended the monarchy. Reputation once lost is hard to rebuild, and in an era where perception often outweighs fact, the very existence of a family member's lawsuit threatened to chip away at the credibility she had worked so hard to claim. For Samantha, however, the case was framed as something deeper than legal victory or financial gain. It was, in her own words, a fight for vindication, for the restoration of her name after years of being branded as dangerous, bitter, or obsessed. Thomas Markle's involvement only heightened the emotional gravity. To see a father aligned with one daughter against another added a tragic undertone to the proceedings, transforming what could have been dismissed as sibling rivalry into a generational fracture. In interviews, Thomas described his testimony not as vengeance, but as truth-telling, an attempt to ensure that history recorded his role in Meghan's life accurately, rather than erasing him as a footnote. Whether one views this as a father's desperate need for acknowledgement or as betrayal, the effect is undeniable. The courtroom showdown has become a parable about loyalty, family bonds, and the price of controlling one's narrative in the public eye. The media, of course, has amplified every detail. Some outlets continue to portray Meghan as the target of a vindictive campaign, a woman besieged by toxic relatives desperate for relevance. Others adopt Samantha's framing, calling this the first real opportunity to puncture Meghan's Cinderella myth and expose what they see as the machinery of calculated PR. Social media reflects this split in real time, with hashtags telling the story of a divided audience: those defending Meghan's right to define her own story, and those demanding accountability for what they believe is a campaign of erasure against family and former allies alike. And now, as the case moves forward, the central tension lingers. Is Meghan truly the victim of a dysfunctional family determined to exploit her fame, or is she the architect of a narrative so tightly controlled that it leaves casualties in its wake? The answer may not be clear until the final verdict is read, yet the battle for perception is already being waged, and in that arena, public opinion is just as decisive as any judge's ruling. So the question falls to you: is Meghan Markle a woman courageously defending herself against toxic attacks from her estranged family, or is Samantha right to call her a manipulator who erased her past to build a flawless global brand? Where do you stand with Team Meghan, who see her as a survivor, or with Team Samantha, who argue the evidence points to erasure and manipulation? The courtroom will eventually decide on paper, but tonight the verdict belongs to you.